I don't know, maybe 800 cyclists here today. Race. Ultegra. That's a different one. They say. 105. That's a good one. You ride all the way from Stirling?
Yeah.
Yeah, real good. But it was cold there.
Yeah.
7 degrees or something. Ultegra. Out of all the bikes here, by far the majority of the cranksets on the bikes are Shimano. Ultegra actually. Shimano cranksets. They're a very good crankset and they're the most populous on the market. They're also very light, but they're very strong. And how they achieve those two factors together is, instead of having this crank here being solid like it used to be in years gone past, they hollow them out. And the same with the bottom bracket axle, it's hollow. So they're actually done for a very reasonable price, of course, unless of course you're talking about Durace or XTR. They're top of the range model, they're rather pricey, but they're still a very good performing crankset. Now, there's a high chance that you've ridden or are still riding one of these 4 cranksets. The Shimano Ultegra 6800, the Shimano Ultegra R8000, the Shimano Durace 9000, or its newer one, the Shimano Durace R9100, which I haven't got here, but here's the picture. And they have one thing in common. Unfortunately, they are breaking or failing at a much higher rate than any other crankset on the market. Whilst there are a few documented Shimano Holotech left-hand crank failures and bottom bracket axle failures, by far the majority of failures are on the right-hand crank side. Now, even though your crankset on your bike is not considered a critical safety component, unlike the fork steerer on your frame here, if that cracks, you're going to go over your handlebars, and if you're going at any reasonable speed, you're going to hurt yourself pretty badly. So with these cranksets that are failing, what you need to know and what you can do about it if you've got these cranksets on your bike. Now, 2 of these cranksets here have failed, this older Durace one and a slightly older Ultegra model one, and they both belong to the same person. So let's have a closer look at how they're cracked and why they might have cracked.
Because I broke a 9000, I broke a 6800, I think it's 6 or 7 years.
Before it cracked.
Before it cracked. But the 9800 one, only had that for 3 years. Because I wanted to go to...
You mean the 6800?
The 6800, sorry, the 6800
for 3 years.
For 3, I think it's about 3 years, three
so
and a
you
half
probably
years.
would have got 20,000 kilometres.
Would have been around that.
Yeah.
Shimano, you owe me 2 cranks now.
So he's got 105 on the moment, no hassles with 105.
No. And
the
wax chain.
The wax chain. Having a closer inspection of the Ultegra 6800 crankset we have, it's cracked on the inside of the crank arm just above the pedal thread. This is the most common failure point. You can see the bonding has given away and the back face is lifting away from the front face. This begs the question, did the bond give way first, causing a crack, or did it crack first, causing the bond to come unstuck? What do you think? On inspecting the front of the crank, the front face and the large chainring line is flush and smooth on one of the arms, but on one of the opposite arms you can feel your finger catching on the face plate, which is lifting. A closer view from the side, you can see that the normal arm is flush, which is how all the arms should be on your crank, but the arm on the other side, the face plate, is lifting up and away. So if you see this on any one of the 4 arms on your crank, chances are the bonding has come unstuck. The Durace 9000 crankset, again the back of the right hand crank arm, two marks. We'll have a close look at the upper mark, and it looks more like a scratch. And using a macro lens, you can see the mark goes across both the inner and the outer plate, not affecting the joint. It's only superficial, so it's only a scratch. The bottom mark though, it's in that suspicious place just above the pedal thread. Certainly looks like a crack, and with the macro lens you can see it starts at the bonded joint and it goes across the inner plate, and it's a secondary crack as well. In fact, this third mark there could even be another crack forming. The front of this Durace crankset, exactly the same scenario. The front faceplate is lifting up and away. And a lower gap here between the large chainring and the faceplate is indicative of a twisting force, which is normal when we pedal our bike, but the gap is not normal. So our rider, having experienced failures with his Durace and Ultegra cranks, has gone for Shimano 105, because it's extremely rare that you'll find a failure of a Shimano 105 crank. And it's the same with Shimano Claris, Tiagra and Sora cranksets. They don't seem to be failing either. You can see the difference looking at the back of this Ultegra right hand crank. You can see the inner crank arm and the spider is glued. Yes, this is glue here. Shimano call this bonding. It is epoxy after all. The spider or front faceplate is where the chainrings are bolted onto. And the glue or the bonding follows the join along the outside of the spider and down the crank arm. So because there's a hollow between the back plate and the front plate, Shimano call this crank hollow bonded. With the 105 and the three other cranksets, they are all one piece cast, so no gluing at all. And it's called hollow forged. Here's a hollow forged crank sliced lengthways in half, and as you can see it's one piece aluminium but it's hollow in the middle. A different view, you can see hollow bonded, two pieces, hollow forged, one piece. And the back of the right hand cranks, you can see the hollow bonded one, two pieces glued at the join of the front and the rear faces, but the hollow forged, no join because it's one piece.
Now, the common consensus is the failure rate's pretty low, so don't worry about it. What's the chance of one person experiencing two failure rates? And it doesn't take much looking on the interweb like forums to realise there's quite a few people out there that are experiencing multiple failures of these cranks. Another thing you might say is, this guy, he treats his bike like rubbish. You should see how he goes over the bumps. Or, he weighs too much. The guy's a big guy. Or, the weather we ride in is terrible. No wonder the cranks failed. Well, what do you call normal use on a bicycle? What about some of our pro rider sprinters putting out 1800 watts? Would you call that normal use? How come they don't break their cranks? Or do they? One of the best compilations of reasons why these cranks may be failing I saw is by Peak Talk on YouTube. Have a look at him and he'll explain it for you much better than I can. So one of the possible scenarios he said was moisture. So that air cavity inside of your crank, and the hollow crank contains moisture, as all air usually does. And that moisture, when it gets cold, it condenses onto the metal in the inside of that crank, which is aluminium. And then when the temperature rises, it vaporizes again into that air cavity. And then of course when it cools down again, it grips back onto the aluminium surface on the inside. So it's going through a cycle, and that cycle causes corrosion on the inside of the aluminium. So that's a very possible scenario. Another good explanation he presents is if you turn the crank over and have a look at the back, you'll see where the two shells are joined and glued, there's a gap. So that gap, even though it's very, very small, could still allow some moisture to get in there. And of course, it's going to start that cyclic effect again of damaging the aluminium. So that's a good possible scenario of why they come apart up near the spider. Another slightly less technical reason why it might be happening is shear force going through the crank. Now, I'm not talking about leg power, I'm talking about the weight of the rider. For instance, in this rider who's broken these two cranks, weighs slightly over 100 kilos, and if he's going over the bumps, like we all do, you take your weight off your seat a bit, don't you? And so more weight goes not so much on your hands, but on your feet, on your pedals, through the axle, through the cranks. So when you go over the bumps, you seesaw over the bumps. So you can imagine a lot more force going through the crank like this. And when you weigh a fair bit, that's a fair bit of force which could do the damage. Another reason it could be is when you unclip, say at the light or at a cafe or wherever you are, whenever you stop, you unclip. And which foot do you unclip? It's usually the left one. So the weight goes on to the right pedal. Maybe not all your weight, but it's certainly a difference because instead of balancing the weight between your two legs, you've now got considerably more force on the right hand side. So what will Shimano do about this? Has there been a recall of these cranksets? No. Has there ever been a recall by Shimano of cranksets? Yes, there has. It was in 1997 in the US, and it was for the cranksets FC-C79, FCM290 and FCMC12, and that affected 49 different brand names using those cranks on those bikes in the US, and Shimano recognized that as a recall. And here's something interesting. If you have a look at your instructions for your crankset, you read on there, and I'll quote it for you. Here's the instructions from the crankset. And you'll see, under important safety information, warning. Check that there are no cracks in the crank arms before riding the bicycle. If there are any cracks, the crank arm may break and you may fall off the bicycle. Be careful not to let the cuffs of your clothes, etc. So there you go, cracks in the crank. Like all products, they have designers, and the designers have three very important things in mind, and that is make sure the cranks are strong but light, but also fairly cheap to manufacture. So manufacturing and also the materials that it's made from. So you need to balance it all up so that it makes a consumable product. So for like these cranks, you could say a certain percentage of these cranks need to remain trouble-free for a certain lifespan. Let's just pull some figures out of the air and say 95% of this product must be still functioning after 40,000 kilometers. Now those decisions are called a safety margin. So these designers or engineers have to make sure that the product makes money for the company, profit, which is fair enough, but also means, like in the old days when products used to last a long, long time, imagine a crankset, you pass it on from one frame to another, from one bike to another maybe. Well, that doesn't happen these days. A product is designed for a certain amount of life, and then what do? It's disposable. You throw it out and buy a new one, so it probably gets recycled. So what can you do if you've got one of these cranksets on your bike? First of all, be aware of any signs of failure, and they can be very easy to miss. For instance, you might have small amount of clicking or some creaking going on in your shoes or the pedals or the cranks. Maybe as you're pedaling around, the shoe or the pedal axle feels like it's on an angle, slightly skewed. Well, they are definitely early signs of maybe possible crank fracture.
So on the power stroke, at the bottom of the stroke, the foot pushed out. You could feel it pushing out.
Oh, like the pedal was slightly coming.
Yeah, it felt like the pedal had a buckle in it.
Oh, yeah.
So I powered down, and it felt like you were throwing your foot outwards. And then I thought, oh, that doesn't feel right. And then it just progressively got worse and worse. And then when we got back,
Every now and then, maybe when you're cleaning your bike, feel for any cracks or lifting behind the crank arm, especially just above the pedal thread, and then also where the four arms join the large chainring. And then don't forget to check the left-hand crank as well. Then do a visual inspection. Viewing at different angles helps the light bring out any hairline cracks that you can't always feel with your fingers. If you find any of the signs we've discussed, or any other, it will be wise not to ride your bike with that crankset for safety reasons. If you have the original receipt for the crankset, whether it's a hard copy or electronic, contact the seller and inquire about a warranty claim. Now, if your crankset fails on you while you're riding and you don't have an accident, that's a good thing. However, if your crankset's out of warranty, then it's still going to cost you money to buy another crankset anyhow. If you need to replace a faulty crank but the warranty doesn't stand, you will need to purchase a new crank. So you can either purchase a compatible crankset without chainrings or a complete crankset with chainrings. Be very wary of buying a second-hand crankset of which Shimano models have these faults. You may just be buying someone else's faulty crankset, whether the seller knows it or not.
Now you might be thinking what you could do is just buy the later model of the Dura-Ace or Ultegra right hand crank only without chainrings. Then transfer over the chainrings from your faulty crankset, which are probably in good condition anyhow, onto that newer model. Well, great thinking, but unfortunately Shimano have made it the inner one's probably compatible, but the outer one on one of the arms had a little chamfer, so they make it that it doesn't quite fit on the newer model crankset. So there you go. If anyone has an idea how you can actually modify that, maybe file a little bit off of that chainring, then maybe you can transfer it over. Let us know in the comments. That'd be really handy for so many of us. So I hope this video has been helpful for you in determining whether you're riding with a faulty Shimano crankset and what to do about it. And let's hope that Shimano have addressed this crank issue in their new 12-speed group sets. Remember the old Shimano 600 Ultegra? They didn't break, did they? No, but the new ones do.
Actually, right?
Go on. Go on.
No, nothing.
One thing I learned today, apparently it's okay and perfectly healthy to smoke if you've got a fantabulous bike.